But a dream that I had had was fulfilled, and I was able to work at the New York Jung Foundation. And I met Dr. Edinger on the telephone. And of course, he was at one end and I the other, so I had no idea what he looked like, nor did he have any idea of what I looked like. But my first assignment there was to type his manuscript for Moby Dick. And I loved Moby Dick, but I hated the machine that I was typing on because it was a typesetting machine, and I'm not a sensate person, and it was miserable. But that's how I first met Dr. Edinger. That's a lot of years ago. He was chairman of the training program at that time and was very involved with the teaching. And I used to very covetously wish that I could be a small person in his alchemy class because I know what a specialist he is in that particular domain. He's a graduate of Indiana University, has his medical degree from Yale University. He was on the board at the foundation. He's now living in LA. He is a Jungian analyst. He is still teaching at the LA Institute. We're very privileged, and I particularly, to be able to introduce Dr. Edward Edinger, and we welcome you to the Friends of Jung San Diego, Dr. Edinger.
This is my fourth visit to your beautiful city, and I'm very pleased to be here. I've always been treated with extraordinary kindness and hospitality, and it gives me a great pleasure to be able to return once again. I'm going to talk to you tonight about some rather deep and abstruse material, and I very much hope I don't lose you in the process. What I hope to be able to do is to introduce you to and perhaps mediate for you some major matters that concerned Jung in his last years. And of course, the more one studies Jung, the more one realizes that the farther along you go in his life work, the harder it is to follow him. The vast majority of people can follow him up to 1912, let's say. A smaller number can follow him up to maybe 1920, when the types came out. After that, it gets very difficult. And after 1950, well, for most people, they forget it. But that's what I'm going to attempt to introduce to you, at least in some brief fashion. Because in those last years, what Jung was concerned to do was to relate his discoveries concerning the nature of the individual psyche to the overall development of the collective Western psyche in its whole historical cultural development. So that's what we're going to venture into a little bit tonight. The major book in which he engages this matter is his book entitled Eon, published originally in German in 1951. So what I would hope to do is to give you some introduction to that deep and wonderful work, and I hope maybe a few of you sooner or later will have the courage to venture into an exploration of that for yourself. I'm going to be talking tonight about need for a myth. Because we know from the work of historians and anthropologists that in order for a human society to remain alive and soundly functioning, it requires a central operative myth, which conveys a religious way of life to the individual members of that society. And it's generally recognized by thoughtful people that Western society no longer has a living myth. And that's a very dangerous state of affairs. On the other hand, whenever danger comes to mind, I think of the lines of Holderlin that Jung was fond of quoting. Where danger is, grows also the rescuing power. And I think that that idea is illustrated in the appearance of Jung at this particular stage in the history of Western society. Because the historical spirit that has brought us to our current dangerous state of mythlessness has also brought us the work of Jung. And his work has created the possibility of a whole new myth, a whole new worldview or life attitude, which gives us an opportunity to replace or revivify our lost myth. You see, Jung penetrated to a deeper level of the psyche than did Freud. He discovered what he called the collective unconscious, also termed the objective psyche or the archetypal psyche. And in his practical work with patients, he came to realize that in just about all patients over the age of 35, on the verge of the second half of life, did not achieve a real cure unless they found a religious attitude toward life. Now this, of course, had nothing to do with allegiance to a creed. Jung has given a very nice definition of religion as the attitude peculiar to a consciousness which has been changed by the experience of the numinosum. In other words, religion is the consequence of an experience. Now, without going into details, we might describe the numinosum as the religion-creating archetype in the psyche. It's the God image, which, if one has a living experience of it, generates a religious attitude just by virtue of the experience. You don't have to have faith. You don't have to strain to sacrifice your intellect or your doubts or anything else. If you have the living experience, that's the demonstration. Now, modern man, in increasing numbers, is obliged to seek this original experience just because he's lost the orientation provided by the traditional religion. And since he's lost his containment in this old myth, he's in urgent need of a new one. And this is what I'm going to talk about tonight, what I call the myth for modern man. First, I want to inquire, what is modern man? Jung gives a very explicit description of modern man, and you can find this, if you're interested, in starting in paragraph 149 of volume 10 of the collected works. I'm going to quote a fairly lengthy quotation because it's so relevant, but listen to it because it's good. The man we call modern, the man who is aware of the immediate present, is by no means the average man. The man who has attained consciousness of the present is solitary. The modern man has at all times been so, for every step towards fuller consciousness removes him further from his original, purely animal participation mystique with the herd. That is, from submersion in a common unconsciousness. Every step forward means tearing oneself loose from the maternal womb of unconsciousness in which the mass of men dwells. Even in a civilized community, the people who form, psychologically speaking, the lowest stratum live in a state of unconsciousness little different from that of primitives. Those of the succeeding strata live on a level of consciousness which corresponds to the beginnings of human culture, while those of the highest stratum have a consciousness that reflects the life of the last few centuries. Only the man who is modern in our meaning of the term really lives in the present. He alone has a present-day consciousness, and he alone finds that the ways of life on those earlier levels have begun to pall upon him. The values and strivings of those past worlds no longer interest him, save from the historical standpoint. Thus, he becomes unhistorical. He has estranged himself from the mass of men who live entirely within the bounds of tradition. Indeed, he is completely modern only when he has come to the very edge of the world, leaving behind him all that has been discarded and outgrown, and acknowledging that he stands before the nothing out of which all may grow. An honest mission of modernity means voluntarily declaring oneself bankrupt, taking the vows of poverty and chastity in a new sense, and what is still more painful, renouncing the halo of sanctity which history bestows. To be unhistorical is the Promethean sin, and in this sense, the modern man is sinful. A higher level of consciousness is like a burden of guilt. But as I have said, only the man who has outgrown the stages of consciousness belonging to the past can achieve full consciousness of the present. To do this, he must be sound and proficient in the best sense. It is these qualities which enable him to gain the next highest level of consciousness. End quote. You'll note that Jung called the modern man unhistorical. This means that he's no longer contained in a tradition. That is, his individual identity is no longer propped up by unconscious containment in a religious, cultural, or ethnic identification. He's alone, and he's without a myth. And when this state of affairs happens to a large number of people, it creates a problem for the society as a whole. Now, it's very interesting that the Christian myth has presaged this state of affairs. Jung talks about this in Eon And here he points out that the Christian myth has built into it itself the idea of an enantiodromia. Let me tell you what an enantiodromia is. That refers to a turning into its opposite. High turning into low, cold turning into hot, and so on. Christian myth has built into it the idea of an enantiodromia, which is evidenced by the fact that it predicts that the figure of Christ will be followed by his opposite, namely Satan, the Antichrist. Concerning this, Jung writes, and I quote, this is from Eon, paragraph 68. The de-Christianization of our world, the Luciferian development of science and technology, and the frightful material and moral destruction left behind by the Second World War have been compared more than once with the eschatological events foretold in the New Testament. These, as we know, are concerned with the coming of the Antichrist. The apocalypse is full of expectations of terrible things that will take place at the end of time before the marriage of the Lamb. This shows plainly that the Christian soul has a sure knowledge not only of the existence of an adversary, but also of his future usurpation of power. In considerable detail, Jung discusses the whole psychological phenomenon of Antichrist being following the image of Christ in the Christian eon that we are now coming to an end of. According to astrological symbolism, the Christian eon corresponds to the age of Pisces, because the spring point has been passing through the constellation of Pisces during the Christian eon. And the first fish in that constellation has been associated with Christ, and the second fish of the constellation has been associated with Antichrist. Jung says, it's a matter of astronomical fact that the spring point entered the second fish, about the 16th century, the time of the Reformation and the Renaissance. And with these, there comes that spirit which culminates in the modern age. That's the spirit of Antichrist. Now, it's very interesting that precisely at this time, let's say 1500 AD, the legend of Faust arose. This legend belongs to the same symbolism as that of Antichrist. According to this legend, Dr. Faustus, a very learned physician, became bored with his empty life, and he invokes and communicates with the devil and sells his soul to the devil in return for magical knowledge, pleasure, and power. And among other things, he's granted the power to evoke the figures of Greek mythology, including Helen of Troy, so that the devil permits him to have Helen of Troy as his paramour. And then finally, after a certain period of time, like his cousin Don Juan, Faust must pay the piper, and he's dragged into hell by the devil. That's the basic story. It's quite remarkable. During the past 500 years, that story has been told again and again and again in poetry, prose, and music. One scholar has written a book describing in detail 50 different versions of Faust, and there are a lot more than that even. Probably the most notable versions are Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus of 1592, Goethe's Faust of 1808 and 1832, and in modern times, Thomas Mann's novel Dr. Faustus, published in 1947, which was based on the life of Nietzsche. You see, behind the Christian myth stands the figure of the historical Jesus of Nazareth. And similarly, behind the Faust myth stands the historical figure of Dr. John Faustus. There was a historical Faust. It's not just a legend. And he lived from approximately 1480 to 1540. Not much is known about him, but there is definite historical evidence that he lived. He was a personal acquaintance of the Protestant reformer Melanchthon, who we are informed believed in the reality of his powers. He is said to have died during a demonstration of flying, which he was putting on for a royal audience. Very shortly after his death, legendary material so quickly obscured his biography that, as with Christ, we can't see much of the historical Faust, and all we have is the legend. But I think it's highly significant for understanding this myth that the historical Faust was a contemporary of the following people: Martin Luther, the reformer; Leonardo da Vinci, the greatest artist of the Renaissance; Paracelsus, the great alchemist, apothecary physician; Columbus, who discovered America; Erasmus, the great humanist scholar, who was the first that made the New Testament available in Greek; Copernicus, the discoverer of the Copernican view of the solar system; Vesalius, the great human anatomist; and Machiavelli, the pioneer of objective statecraft. All of these are contemporaries of Dr. John Faustus, and hence all of them partake in one way or another of the Faust legend, you see. Because what we can say now, looking back through the 16th century, we can see that what happened then is that the God image fell out of heaven into the human psyche. If you understand what that means. In the course of that fall, out of its metaphysical status to the status of human psychological experience, in the course of that movement from heaven to earth, the God image undergoes an enantiodromia. It turns from Christ to Antichrist. It turns from Christ to Faust, so to speak. And this course of events was predicted long ago in the book of Revelation, where we read in the 12th chapter, in the 12th verse, "Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time." From the standpoint of Jungian psychology, this is what happened in the 16th century. Now, of course, the men of the Renaissance and the Reformation and the scientific revolution, the artists, the scholars, the scientists, the explorers, and the reformers, they certainly didn't consider their experience as devilish or deriving from Antichrist. Certainly not. They all thought of themselves as good Christians. They were just excited by the expansion of human knowledge and energy. And they thought that was perfectly compatible with containment in the Christian religion. But they were wrong. History proved them wrong. Because things look different from the standpoint of the unconscious. Because what the unconscious does at this time is it throws up like a compensating dream the Faust legend. And the Faust legend informs us that what's going on is dealings with the devil, dealings with Antichrist. However, nobody noticed what happened. Until about the 19th century, when a few sensitive souls began to realize that something was seriously wrong in the psyche of Western man. For instance, Wordsworth, at the beginning of the century, in one of his poems, confesses to a feeling of forlornness and yearns for the pagan world. And he indeed did try to deal with the lost Christian myth by a regression to paganism, to pagan nature worship. Another sensitive poetic soul of the 19th century I want to look at a little more closely. This was Matthew Arnold, who lived from 1822 to 1888. He was the son of the pious schoolmaster of Rugby, Thomas Arnold. In his youth, he wrote a classic 19th century lament for our lost religious myth. And I want to read that lament to you. It's really a threnody to the lost God. It was written in 1851, and the title of it is Dover Beach. The sea is calm tonight, the tide is full, the moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand, glimmering and vast, out in the tranquil bay. Come to the window, sweet is the night air. Only from the long line of spray where the sea meets the moon-blanched land, listen. You hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand, begin and cease, and then again begin with tremulous cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find also in the sound a thought, hearing it by this distant northern sea. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. Ah, love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. You see, this retreating sea of faith that he's speaking of, that's the Judeo-Christian myth, which was no longer serving to contain the advanced minds of the 19th century. And like orphans who have lost their mother, they are ejected into the cold, cruel world where there is no joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. It's quite interesting that the only hope that Arnold can offer is that a personal love relationship might carry the meaning of the lost connection with God. In fact, he wrote that poem on his honeymoon. But as psychologists, we know that a personal relationship cannot stand up under the burden of such excessive weight as that. It can't be a substitute for the God image. It would break under the load. Matthew Arnold is out of fashion now, but many young lovers of my generation and the generation preceding mine recited Dover Beach to each other in utmost seriousness. But this solution to the problem of the lost myth won't work. It's also significant how the poem ends. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. That's an image of the activated opposites. A striking, dramatic image. Ignorant armies clash by night. See, this is the problem that confronts the man who has lost his containing myth, because the activated God image, when it first comes into human experience, appears as a pair of opposites. So when Mephistopheles confronted Faust, he opened up the problem of opposites in the same fashion as the serpent in the Garden of Eden opened up the problem of opposites for Adam and Eve when he told them to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's the consciousness of the opposites that comes out from eating that fruit. Later in the 19th century, Nietzsche nailed down the fact completely, the psychological fact, in his work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He announced unequivocally that God is dead. Jung says about that, when Nietzsche said that God is dead, He uttered a truth which is valid for the greater part of Europe. People were influenced by it not because he said so, but because it stated a widespread psychological fact. And the consequences were not long delayed. After the fog of isms, the catastrophe. Now, in the 20th century, it's become an open secret that God is indeed dead. And this is no glib intellectualism. It's a terrifying psychic fact for an increasing number of individuals. Now, let me summarize for you my historical observations to this point. About 1500 AD, the God image fell out of heaven into the human psyche. In other words, it was withdrawn from metaphysical projection and became available for direct conscious experience. This event had a twofold effect. On the one hand, it greatly increased available energy to the individual ego, promoting investigation of previously forbidden areas. But on the other hand, it had the delayed effect of alienating the ego from its transpersonal connection, from its sense of having divine guidance. And this then led to the progressive realization that man is an orphan in a meaningless universe. This double effect, increased energy and power for the ego, linked to a lost relation to God, constitutes a psychological state of inflation and or despair. Now, the collective view is that the last 500 years has been a time of great progress and advancement, and so it has. But the unconscious, as indicated by myth and legend, characterize this period as the advent of Antichrist and diabolical Faustian man. The realization of man's lost and desperate condition began to dawn in the 19th century and reached major proportions in the 20th century. So it's in this historical setting that the advent of Jung occurred with his discovery of the process of individuation. So what had been going on in the collective psyche since 1500 AD, the descent of the God image into empirical man, finally reaches full individual consciousness in C.G. Jung. And that happened specifically during his confrontation with the unconscious, beginning on December 12, 1913, and lasting until 1918. This experience enabled Jung to discover empirically the collective unconscious. And it followed his realization, as he tells us in his autobiography, his realization that he had no myth. And this experience was his first step in the discovery of his new myth. And we can now realize that what happened to Jung is typical. Namely, that the discovery of a new myth, or the revitalization of an old one, requires that the individual have a direct experience of the collective unconscious. That's what will do the job. However, there is a hitch, because such experience is dangerous. It can destroy as well as heal, because it opens up the opposites, and the individual can be torn apart by the opposites unless the imagery emerges which unites them. The images of the self. And it's the discovery of those images that unite the opposites, which constitute the process of individuation. Another way of putting it is individuation is the process whereby the ego encounters the self, the inner God image, and establishes a living relationship to it. And when that happens, the lost God image is rediscovered within. But the word Jung uses for the inner God image is the word self, with a capital S. But this very word indicates what a highly ambiguous endeavor individuation is. Because that word self reminds us of selfishness. It reminds us of self-centered narcissism. It reminds us of solipsistic megalomania. The word self is very ambiguous. It doesn't have a very good odor in contemporary usage. And our apprehension is only increased when we learn that Jung describes individuation as the continuing incarnation of God. And in talking about that, he quotes Christ saying in the 10th chapter of John, "I said you are gods." This sounds like pretty dangerous doctrine. In fact, it sounds very similar to Faust's experiment with the devil. Because here was Faust, initially a good man, who exposed himself to evil and opened himself to the experience of the opposites. So he becomes the prototype of the modern man who sets forth on that dangerous journey of individuation. The story of Faust is an image of what we do when we take the unconscious seriously, really seriously. Jung puts it in very stark terms. This comes from paragraph 41 of Psychology and Alchemy. And I quote, "There have always been people who, not satisfied with the dominance of conscious life, set forth under cover and by devious paths to their destruction or salvation to seek direct experience of the eternal roots, and following the lure of the restless unconscious psyche, find themselves in the wilderness, where, like Jesus, they come up against the son of darkness." End quote. See, the obvious danger in this operation is that the ego will identify with the self and succumb to an atheistical inflation. In fact, that's a very grave danger of modern man. The contrary danger is that of alienation, a state of disconnection from the self, causing despair. And that's really just the other side of the coin from the inflation. They're really two sides of the same phenomenon. But between this Scylla and Charybdis lies the possibility of individuation in which the ego consciously connects with the self but does not identify with it. Now, this is easier said than done. Leads immediately to the problem of the opposites, which expose one to severe inner conflict. If one can endure the conflict of these activated opposites, usually the unconscious will generate symbols of what we call the conjunctio, namely symbols of reconciliation, symbols of marriage between the opposites. This is what happens in the Faust legend, because the central theme of the Faust story in its developed form, and Goethe's Faust is the most developed one we have. In its developed form, the conjunctio theme is the central theme of the legend. In Goethe's version, for instance, in part one, we have the union of Faust and Gretchen, and in part two, we have the union of Faust and Helen of Troy, an archetypal figure. In a letter, Jung writes concerning this matter these words, and I quote, "Goethe's Faust is an opus alchemicum in the best sense. As in the alchemy, the mystery of the conjunctio runs through the whole of Faust. I have devoted a special work to this problem, Mysterium Conjunctionis. It contains everything that forms the historical background, so far as this is alchemical, of Faust. These roots go very deep and seem to me to explain much of the numinous effect which emanates from Goethe's main work." So from these words, we can see that Jung's master work, Mysterium Conjunctionis, can be considered as the culmination of the Faust legend, and Jung himself can be considered as the ultimate Faustian man. I should say about the book Mysterium Conjunctionis that it's an exhaustive discussion of the symbolism of the conjunctio in alchemy and related material, because in Jung's later years he saw that symbolic image as the crucial one which is able to provide the healing for modern man, and that's why he gave such great efforts to elaboration of that image, the image of the conjunctio. The mystery of the conjunctio is the mystery of individuation itself. It poses the terrible question, how can the individual consciously experience the opposites without being torn apart by them? And it answers this question by means of the symbolic imagery of the conjunctio, which are images expressing the self in its capacity as reconciler of opposites. Let me talk a bit about opposites on the level of individual psychology now. I've been talking about the historical factors up to now. Now let's talk about how these matters impinge upon the individual. Certainly the most crucial and terrifying pair of opposites is the opposites good and evil. The very survival of the ego depends on how it relates to this matter. In order to survive, the ego must experience itself as more good than bad. This explains the creation of what we call the shadow in childhood, in the early phase of psychological development. The young ego can tolerate very little experience of its own badness without succumbing to demoralization. This accounts for the universal phenomenon we see all around us, the phenomenon that obliges us to locate evil. Whenever something evil happens, its cause or blame, the responsibility for it, if at all possible, must be located. Somebody must carry the burden of that evil. Now, with maturation of the ego in the process of individuation, this changes somewhat. The individual becomes able, a little bit anyway, I don't want to be overly optimistic in this regard, but a little bit anyway, becomes able to take on himself the task of being the carrier of evil, rather than having to locate it outside himself for his own survival. Or another way of putting it, he becomes capable of carrying the opposites. And to the extent he is capable of carrying the opposites, he is thereby promoting the conjunctio, promoting it so far as the collective psyche is concerned. In an early phase of this capacity, of the recognition of the opposites, we have what might be called the pendulum phase. During this phase, the individual is cast back and forth between differing moods, between moods of guilty inferiority and unworthiness on the one hand, and on the other hand of optimistic well-being and sense of competence and personal worth. It's as though he encounters darkness and lightness one after the other. Jung makes a quite remarkable statement about this phase. Let me read it to you. This comes from paragraph 206 of Mysterium Conjunctionis. And I quote, "The one after another is a bearable prelude to the deeper knowledge of the side-by-side. For this is an incomparably more difficult problem. Again, the view that good and evil are spiritual forces outside us, and that man is caught in the conflict between them, is more bearable by far than the insight that the opposites are the ineradicable and indispensable preconditions of all psychic life, so much so that life itself is guilt." That may help you understand why Mysterium Conjunctionis is not a very popular book. But perhaps the quotation will give you some idea of what a grave matter it is to really consider seriously the problem of the opposites. I think it can be fairly stated that an understanding of the opposites is the key to the psyche. And once you become familiar with the phenomenon of the opposites, you'll see it everywhere. The operation of the opposites in the collective psyche is exposed to view everywhere. Every war, every contest between groups, every dispute between political factions, even every game is an expression of the opposites striving towards a conjunctio. So whenever the individual falls into an identification with one side of a pair of warring groups or factions, he loses the possibility of being a carrier of the opposites. And at such times then, he locates the enemy, the contrary, the opposite, the evil. He locates it on the outside, and in the course of that exteriorization of one half of himself, he becomes a mass man. Jung puts it this way. This is from paragraph 425 of volume 8 of the Collected Works. If the subjective consciousness prefers the ideas and opinions of collective consciousness and identifies with them, then the contents of the collective unconscious are repressed. And the more highly charged the collective consciousness, the more the ego forfeits its practical importance. It is, as it were, absorbed by the opinions and tendencies of collective consciousness. And the result of that is the mass man, the ever-ready victim of some wretched ism. The ego keeps its integrity only if it does not identify with one of the opposites, and if it understands how to hold the balance between them. This is possible only if it remains conscious of both at once. End quote. Well, let's carry it a step further. How can one become conscious of the opposites, assuming that you aren't to start with? Where are the opposites to be found? Well, I can make a very explicit suggestion. You will find the opposites by examining carefully whatever you love or hate. Socrates long ago said, "The unexamined life is not worth living," and that's a very apt motto for process of individuation. You find the opposites by examining carefully whatever you love or hate. But this is an exceedingly difficult procedure, because the inclination to examine does not usually accompany the passions of love and hate. But it is in our loves and our hates that the opposites reside. The very first sentence of Mysterium Conjunctionis reads this way, and this is really the essence of the whole book. He says, "The factors which come together in the conjunctio are conceived as opposites, either confronting one another in enmity or attracting one another in love." So the conjunctio as an archetype is operating every bit as much in fights as it is in loves. Those are the two ways that unconscious conjunctio energies express themselves, by hatreds or by attractions. So whenever we take too concretely an urge to love or hate, the conjunctio is exteriorized and thereby destroyed. the possibility of a conscious experience of the conjunctio is destroyed. If we are gripped by a strong attraction or a repulsion to a person or a thing, we should reflect on it. Jung says, quote, "Unless we prefer to be made fools of by our illusions, we shall, by carefully analyzing every fascination, extract from it a portion of our own personality, like a quintessence, and slowly come to recognize that we meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life." And similarly with our passionate antipathies, they must be subjected to full analytic scrutiny. We must ask ourselves, what persons do I hate? What groups or factions do I fight against? Because whatever they are, they're a part of me. I am bound to that which I hate as surely as I am bound to that which I love. Psychologically, the important thing is where one's libido is lodged, and not whether he is for or against a given thing. Now, if you pursue such reflections diligently, you will gradually collect your scattered psyche from the outer world, like the dismembered body of Osiris. And it's this kind of work, which is the work of individuation, which creates the conjunctio and in the process promotes a net increase of consciousness in the world. So to conclude, the world is torn asunder by the strife between the opposites. A state of affairs that's grown progressively worse in the past 500 years. This strife between the opposites, what Jung calls the wretched isms. Emerson says, all men plume themselves on the improvement of society, and no man improves. As Jung puts it, if the individual is not truly regenerated in spirit, society cannot be either, for society is the sum total of individuals in need of redemption. And in another place, he makes this suggestion. If only a worldwide consciousness could arise that all division and all fission are due to the splitting of opposites in the psyche, then we should know where to begin. What does lie within our reach is the change in individuals who have or create for themselves an opportunity to influence others of like mind. I do not mean by persuading or preaching. I'm thinking rather of the well-known fact that anyone who has insight into his own actions and has thus found access to the unconscious involuntarily exercises an influence on his environment. End quote. That comes from paragraph 583 of volume 10. See, these individuals with insight into their own actions are the ones who, to a greater or lesser extent, have experienced the conjunctio. They're the ones who are aware of the fact that the opposites go to make up the psyche itself, and therefore go to make up one's own psyche, and therefore they become carriers of the opposites rather than exteriorizers of the opposites. And if society is to be redeemed, it will, according to the standpoint of Jungian psychology anyway, it will be done through the cumulative effect of such individuals. The idea is that when enough individuals can carry the consciousness of wholeness, the world itself will become whole. Well, thank you very much. We'll have about a 10-minute break and then questions or discussions if you have anything. Okay. My presentation lends itself to questions very well. I'd rather do something else. I'd rather read you a couple of more poems and talk about them a little bit. But if a few of you insist on questions, I'll submit. Who has insistent questions? Yes.
I'm aware of the anxiety that arises when we do attempt to carry the opposites or stay between the opposites. You also mentioned that the guilt arises. I wonder if you could just expound a little bit on why guilt is associated as well with anxiety.
Guilt is associated specifically with the opposites good and evil. Yeah, the question was, the questioner understood why anxiety was aroused when one attempted to contain the opposites, but why should guilt be aroused? Guilt is associated with the experience of oneself as evil. And therefore, inevitably, there's going to be a sense of guilt when the good-evil opposites are the ones that are being carried. Then the guilt is not deposited in the other person, you see. Yeah.
There's a very good program last week on PBS called The Sword of Islam.
The what?
The Sword of Islam.
The Sword of Islam. I saw that. Very good program. Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you'd like to comment on the growth of that religion and how it's going to affect our world psychology.
The question is whether I would comment on the growth of Islamic fundamentalism and what effect it may have psychologically. I consider it a very interesting and profoundly significant phenomenon psychologically. Islamic fundamentalism and the terrorism that it breeds, and we very badly need a psychological understanding of that phenomenon. You see, it's a religious phenomenon, even though it's manifesting itself in the political arena. Primarily, it's a religious phenomenon. That means then that the individuals who are living out the terrorism of Islamic fundamentalism are truly living out of identification with the God image. They are sacrificial martyrs for their vision of God. And this has a long history to it in Islam. Goes back many centuries to the to the assassins who would offer themselves for suicide missions to serve as agents of Allah, to become, in effect, personifications of the avenging angel of Yahweh, who offer their life as a religious sacrifice. It's as though the God image that has been lost by a certain level of Western civilization reemerges in the opponents to Western civilization, and then the West becomes identified with Satan. It's one more example of how the whole world is constellating into the opposites that are crying out for the conjunctio. The American-Russian opposition is one example of that, and the Arab-Israeli is another example, and the Muslim versus the West is still another, and all those opposites have at their root, they derive fundamentally from the opposition within the God image. The agony of the unconscious deity is living itself out in world history. Mm-hmm. The question is, when the self unifies the opposites, how does it do it? It's very difficult to describe abstractly what constitutes the experience itself. Is experienced different ways by different people under different circumstances, but our psychological data demonstrates that when an individual falls into a grave conflict, if you pay attention to the unconscious responses, if you pay attention to the dreams, to the fantasies, very often, sooner or later, images of wholeness and reconciliation emerge. If those images are recognized, if they're located and taken hold of and given attention to, then one finds that they have the effect of shifting one to another level of understanding that takes him beyond the conflict that had been almost unendurable beforehand. This is just a matter of empirical experience. That this is what happens under those circumstances. It's necessary, though, for the ego to play a role in this process. The unconscious can throw up a reconciling image, but if the conscious ego doesn't take a hold of it and doesn't recognize it for what it is, it can go by unrealized. And that's where some understanding of the symbolism can be so important. By recognizing in dreams what the significance of certain images is, and then as one pays attention to those emerging images, the very attention seems to have the effect of bringing it into reality, so that the ego and the unconscious become mutual partners then in the enterprise. These things are not something that the unconscious throws up and forces on the ego. The ego has to reach for it and work on assimilating it. It's a mutual effort. Mm-hmm.
What distinction, if any, would you make between God with a capital G and God as a psychic fact?
What's the distinction between God with a capital G and God as a psychic fact? I suppose you mean by God with a capital G, I suppose you mean the God of the theologians, or the metaphysical God. And if that's what you mean, I don't know anything about that God. The only thing that I know anything about at all is what I call the God image, which we have some access to through psychological empiricism. Mm-hmm.
When we are carrying the evil and the good within us, and there is this conjunctio of what forces or what is needed to make sure that the evil part of that is sublimated or handled appropriately, so it doesn't burst forth. We know it's there. We feel like killing someone. We know that then you better well get some feed you with this. But what do we need, or what process do we have to follow through to keep this within bounds?
The basic question, if I understand it, is if one is carrying evil, what keeps us from murder or from acting out the evil propensity that we have? Consciousness is what does it. Mm-hmm. What about the capacity to forgive oneself is the question. If one has to be acknowledge that one's evil, we also need to be able to forgive ourselves. Yes. Mm-hmm. See, it's a very, very grave matter. It's easy to talk about abstractly, but to be conscious of participating in evil is very dangerous psychologically, because if it's overbalanced, one has an inclination then to rid the world of this piece of despicable worthlessness. And that's what's behind a lot of suicide. There's a very apt image of the individuation process that I often have occasion to recall. It's the image of a fisherman out in his boat fishing. He catches fish, contents from the unconscious, and pulls them up out of the depths and puts them onto his boat, and he carries them, so to speak, consciously. But what if he hooks a fish heavier than his boat? If he tries to pull that up onto the boat, the whole thing will go down. And that can happen psychologically, that one can hook a fish in the unconscious that's bigger than you are, and then you don't pull the fish up, it pulls you down. And in such circumstances, you have to cut that line pretty quick and let that fish get away. That great fish that swims in the sea is the God image. And if an ego identifies with the God image, that's what happened to Captain Ahab in Moby Dick, you see. And he harpooned Moby Dick, only he didn't pull Moby Dick up. Moby Dick pulled him down. And that's the way it can work psychologically. Mm-hmm.
Would you like to comment on why you put evil in juxtaposition with good rather than the word bad? Why is
No reason. Good, bad, same thing. No difference.
that a modern myth?
I'm sorry?
It's a modern myth that evil is the opposite of good rather than some other, for example, destructive.
No. Bad is just as good a word. Good and bad, if you prefer that, that's fine. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. Norse mythology had built into it its own destruction, the twilight of the gods, so that would be kind of an example, not as explicit a one, and there may very well be others. Well, it is the most differentiated of all mythological elaborations. Jung goes into considerable detail in his book Ion in talking about the fact that symbolically speaking, the advent of Christ had the effect of splitting Yahweh into his two irreconcilable sides, represented by his good son and his Christ and his bad son, Satan. The Jewish symbolism could very easily incorporate those two sides of Yahweh in a single image, speaking of his right hand of mercy and his left hand of justice, for instance. But the advent of Christ split those two sides apart, and the consequence was then that for those contained in the Christian myth, they identified with the good spiritual side and repressed the opposite. But then as we know psychologically, the repressed always returns sooner or later, and the repressed started returning about 1500 AD. Mm-hmm. Prognosis as to our secular civilization. Well, I'm no prophet, but I don't mind speculating. I have a definite sense, which is no more than my own individual sense, and my sense is that the long-range prognosis is very good. The degree of latent consciousness that has now become possible for the human race to experience is an absolutely magnificent prospect for the future. But the short-range prospects are very bad indeed. Mm-hmm.
Comment on what role the so-called matriarchal, the advent of matriarchal consciousness contributes to the collective individuation process?
Do
As opposed to a patriarchal dominating being.
so how does the matriarchal consciousness or the matriarchal psyche contribute to individuation? Is that what you're saying? I didn't hear that. Are masculine and feminine, and patriarchal and matriarchal are expressions of that same polarity. Certainly, Western civilization, on a conscious level, has had a distinctly patriarchal emphasis during the present eon, but